Hello everyone and welcome to Module 3, Week 6. Today I'm going to go very briefly through all of the readings. They're very dense, so I've structured the discussion boards to help the discussion boards really beef up all of your knowledge on each of these individual theorists. So the first reminder is that your paper proposal is due at the end of this week, in addition to a task that you need to complete. So you need to get both done. Read the directions carefully for both the proposal as well as the final paper project and what it is you're trying to do for that. Read the possible topics that I've listed on the PBWorks wiki. So it's retandbib.pbworks.com. You can add to that list. You don't have to use one from there. Overall, email me with any ideas that you have, concerns that you have, questions that you have, anything that you want to run by me before you submit your proposal. That way you can get a really solid sense if, in the next 4 weeks you can get this paper done. I also want you to note that the beginning half of the Lunsford paper, yes, I know it was very long, but the first half of that paper focused really, really well on a debate within the field, which is exactly what you're doing for your final paper. So use the Lunsford paper as a model for what it is you're trying to accomplish with this final paper for this class. Again, if you guys have any questions about this paper, feel free to email me. It is a large portion of your grade, and I really want you guys to do well. Okay, so let's go through the readings. We started off with Smith chapter 12. So what we're dealing with in chapter 12 and what we're dealing with really in society and history at this time is that context is now becoming important. So where things are happening and how that where is influencing sense making. We can look back at Greek and Roman times when the orators were delivering speeches in the Colosseums, and the way that the Colosseum or the Lyceum, depending on exactly where it was in society, were definitely influencing, but it wasn't discussed as heavily as context now, starting basically with the invention of the TV, starts to influence how we make sense of everything that's going on. So we start off with Richards, we move to Russell. Perlman and Olbrecht-Teicheke focus specifically on the idea of universal audience versus actual audience. Toulmin has all of the breakdown and argument, and then McLuhan, who claims that the medium determines the message, focuses so heavily on the medium and the context. So what I really want you guys to focus on with each of these authors is how does context influence their theory, and how does their theory influence our understanding of context? So with Richards specifically, make sure you pay attention to the idea of linguistics and semiotics. Okay, so with Richards, I want you to pay attention to his linguistics and semiotic model. How does the word that's being spoken compare to the idea that I have in my mind compared to the actual object in the world? And then how does that establish what Richards' whole goal is the idea of a broadcast model. And along with that broadcast model, we also have we have ideal ways of understanding, and we have ideal audiences who can understand in the way that we expect. So if I use a specific term in this class, I can assume a more ideal audience because you've been watching these videos for so many weeks now, for 6. So you have a little bit better sense of what it is I'm talking about, what it is I'm dealing with. So I, as the speaker, can assume more about the reference that are in your minds so that we can come to a real world conclusion that's almost exactly the same. Russell picks up on that and also critiques it, and he's trying to bring Locke back into everything and say, okay, so then how do we get to a more perfect language? As I mentioned, Perlman and Olbrecht-Teicheke have a very, very involved theory, but the really important part for brief notes, although in the discussion board we'll discuss a lot more, is the idea of a universal audience versus actual audience. And what's really important about this idea and this concept is that it's a continuum. So there is a lot of sway back and forth, and you're trying to find a happy medium between who you actually have and pull them over to your universal so that everybody is understanding the message that you're trying to get across. Toulmin was discussed with his warrants, backings, arguments, qualifiers, claims, and the entire model. It was talked about in chapter 12, and then it was talked about again in the Lunsford article, so I'm not going to cover it in much detail here. McLuhan is the next big one, and one of his biggest contributions that's often overlooked is he was the first one to theorize the idea of a global village. We'll see when we get to the feminist chapter next that the idea of globalization is really, really picked up, and at this point we do consider the entire world to be something of a global village. But McLuhan starts off with the idea of television and how that influences and changes what people have access to, what people are expected to know, not just citywide, but worldwide at this point, and then how all of that interacts and how all of that mixes. McLuhan also talks about hot and cold mediums. These are a little bit problematic because of what he thinks an audience actually provides to, or what an audience member fills in the blank for. So a hot medium requires very little participation, while a cold medium requires a significant amount of participation. So for a cold medium or a cool medium like television, we have to fill in the blanks a lot, but for a hot medium like a book, we don't need to. So the story I always tell for this one, when I was little, my mom made me read Where the Red Fern Grows. Tragic. It was the most tragic experience of my young little life, and when I was done with the book, I threw it at her. No, not the best thing to have done, but it's really important when we're talking about McLuhan to consider that particular reaction to a book, because according to McLuhan, I didn't need to do much work to make sense of the book, and while that may have been true, that doesn't mean that I wasn't participating. So we really want to consider the hot and the cool medium, especially with what we can do. We've got fan fiction now related to a lot of books, and we have fan art, and we just have fandoms using all of these different mediums in very, very different ways, which means that we're participating with the original medium in very, very specific ways. So some of McLuhan's ideas haven't held up, but his really, really important point is that the context or the medium, so the computer, the fact that this video is coming through YouTube, it's coming through BB Learn, all of those are influencing how you're making sense of everything that I'm saying, in addition to everything that you've already read prior to watching this video. Okay, so the next that you read is the Lunsford piece, who talks specifically about the Toulmin model, and her goal is to bring context back to Toulmin. So Toulmin discussed it, and he kind of offhandedly discussed context, but it was there, and so Lunsford says, okay, then let's add a whole lot more. And her whole point, especially in the classroom, is that a classroom context is not static, and a classroom is not the same. For those of you that have taught, especially if you've taught multiple sections of the same class, or even from semester to semester, how similar are each of those classes? We make adjustments depending on who we're teaching and what we're teaching. We change our examples so that it's more meaningful for that particular group of students based on what we figured out they like, which means all classroom contexts are co-created or negotiated by the student, the instructor, and the situation. So where in my technology-mediated classroom, where the technology is, where the whiteboards are, what color my markers are, whether I'm using both technology and whiteboards at the same time, all influence how I'm going to make meaning, where I'm going to put notes, how I'm going to interact with my students, and all of that needs to be accounted for. And all of that becomes co-created between me and the students of that particular classroom, with the context, with the content. So it can't be decided by the instructor. Even, type A personalities, control freaks go into classrooms and they can't control everything. It's always co-created, it's always negotiated. We need to keep that in mind. So Lunsford says, well, now that we've acknowledged that, we need to acknowledge researcher bias. That means that the researcher cannot say this is the context and that's it. The researcher needs to be more familiar with it. So she brings in the idea of communities of practice, which she deals with on page 121, and the idea that all meaning is situated, which she deals with on page 122 of her article, to then understand, okay, how does the Toulmin model, or how can the Toulmin model function if we start with communities of practice and we start with situated meaning, and then we move out of that co-creation and out of that negotiation towards actually understanding argument structure. The second set that we read for this week is Smith's chapter 13. Okay, this is by far one of my favorite and one of my most hated chapters. Smith makes Foucault and Lyotard and Derrida and Baudrillard so understandable because postmodernism is very dense that it's fantastic. And then he refers to de Beauvoir as Sartre's girlfriend. And I'm like, really? That's how you're going to treat a feminist? And then he lists off all of the awards that Butler has received and all of the academic standings that she's had, like she needs titles to add weight to who she is as a feminist scholar, which is anti-feminist. So Smith's got some problems in this chapter, but that's okay. He deals with a lot of people, and we're going to explore them more in the discussion boards because there's just not enough space here to go through each of them. So next we talked about Royster and Kirsch, who are talking about using feminism and considering feminism as a way of tacking in and tacking out. One of the biggest controversies right now in feminism is the traditional standard definition of feminism is a fairly white middle class view of feminism. So a lot of feminists today, and we can see a lot of this being influenced by Royster and Kirsch, and we can see Royster and Kirsch also influencing this because their article came out in 2012, is how do we become more inclusive? How do we include more women of color, more women with different experiences, more women with different voices? How do we account for the variations of just life that women experience in a theory as a way to then make a lot of things better? So Royster and Kirsch's approach is tacking in and tacking out. So they start with a more inclusive framework that's internal. So how do we focus on this group? How do we account for these women? How do we let them account for themselves? How do we let them speak for themselves? And then, so that's tacking in. And then if we take that more globally, how do we contextualize this paradigm, especially the shifted paradigm where we're including more women's voices, into a broader globalized scale? How do we make this applicable across the world? How do we use this particular framework that we learned from this small group of women and then try to find bits and pieces of this elsewhere to continue to help women all across the world? So they're looking at both frameworks that can account for and can accommodate and can include voices from small communities, and then they're trying to develop frameworks off of that, or they're recommending the development of frameworks off of that that can then be applied or looked at or considered on a more global scale to continue to account for all of these different voices. They're trying to be more inclusive with their version of feminism and feminist practices. Jarrett, on Jarrett, there was an original piece, and I actually added a second discussion by Jarrett. So she reflects on this original piece. It's only 2 pages. Make sure that you read it too. But she really reflects on the idea of conflict, because a lot of people were put off by the idea of conflict within a feminist practice. So what Jarrett is developing is a model of conflict and negotiation where she's drawing from the sophists on how do we actually confront and talk about politics, beliefs, values. We don't necessarily want to get in big arguments about abortion in our individual classes, but we want to be open to dealing with the idea that there is a conflict regarding abortion in current modern society today. If our knowledge, our individual knowledge, the ways that we understand writing and the situated practices of writing are constructed socially, which means we do it as a group and we understand it as a group. So I understand, because of this class, more knowledge constructed socially in relation to composition class because that's the focus, and knowledge constructed socially through the discussion boards because that's how we're all interacting. What happens in the composition classroom or in any classroom when we bring up ideas of conflicting values, conflicting beliefs? So we don't need to have a conflict necessarily. We don't need to have a debate necessarily, but we need to be confronting the idea that underlying most of these are values, and they're values that we hold very dearly. So how do those values come to be? What is the meaning behind them? Why do we hold them in those specific ways? And when we start to understand that social construction of knowledge, how can that make us better writers? How can that make us better thinkers? How can that make us better people? Because we'll be able to interact with people who don't even hold the same values as us. So how can we kind of resolve some of our conflict or move beyond the conflict to a place of, if we bring in the Eastern philosophies, to a place of understanding and discussion and peace, because we've come back to the idea of how our knowledge was constructed socially, because we've dealt with conflict. We haven't resolved conflict, but we've dealt with it. And so what she says in the additional piece that I added, and again, it's only 2 pages, so make sure you read it, is that students should construct their own responses. So they're developing ownership and agency over their own thinking, and then they should process, which is to learn, to explore, to write, to discuss, all of those really great verbs that we want in our composition classes, through writing as a way to get at the idea of socially constructed knowledge so they can understand it better, so they can actually deal with all of these conflicts and these ideas. Those were our readings. So what I want to do is just give you brief notes on modernism versus postmodernism to show you where modernism, existentialism influenced postmodernism and what postmodernism is really reacting to. We'll talk about the waves of feminism as well, just to kind of give you a baseline knowledge for where all of this is coming from. So to start off with the idea of modernism and postmodernism. So modernism's goal was to categorize knowledge and values based on a universal imperative, which meant they could get to the right answer. And the goal of modernism was to find the right answer. So how do I, through reason and through knowledge, find the correct category of knowledge that's going to help me place this particular value to make all of the world better? So postmodernism reacts to that by saying, but there is no one way to live your life, and there is no one experience in life. Therefore, how do you expect to find a universal truth? So postmodernism instead focuses, instead of on linearity, on the cyclical nature of being. So we keep coming back to these ideas. And we can definitely see that a lot of these, and I put it on the second one with objectivity replaced by subjectivity. So I, as a person, have a lot of individual power, and I have my own individual experiences. And because of that, my universal truth may not be the same as yours. So I took this class as a grad student. Does that make my experience the same as your experience? Probably not, because I took it a while ago, but we're learning the same subject. So according to modernism, we should be able to get to the exact same universal truth because we both completed a course like this. We're discounting all of our individual subjective experiences and our likes and dislikes in relation to this particular topic. So what postmodernism is being influenced by from existentialism very, very heavily is the idea that I, as a subject, get to experience things in my own way. And because I experience them and then I can experience something else over here, I can then re-reflect on this particular course. And now that I'm teaching it, I'm re-reflecting on my own graduate studies and what I learned and trying to add to make your learning better than what I felt I experienced. And so now I'm back to what I was talking about, but I'm already in a different place. So again, we can't come back to a universal truth. So that's where postmodernism is breaking off. They're also reacting very heavily to the idea that there's a single view. There is, according to postmodernism, no one right way. Everybody has their own individual perspective, and everybody may have multiple perspectives. There's multiplicity, plurality, fragmentation, indeterminacy, and all of that is really, really important. So we can see postmodernism as a reaction to modernism. Existentialism came in the middle, and we can see its influences in postmodernism very, very heavily. And then we're going to see postmodernism influence feminism, especially third wave feminism, because of Marxism. So we're questioning power with postmodernism, we're questioning language, we're questioning history, because all of these, both power, language, and history imply that there's one single view and one right view. And so postmodernism saying, well, if there isn't one right view, then we should be questioning all of these things very, very heavily. And so what feminism is going to add to that is class, race, gender. So if we're questioning all of these other ideas, why not how each individual person is living their life and what their place is within society? So with waves of feminism, first wave feminism was consciousness raising for the most part. And again, in this particular slide, I am narrowing down each of these waves very, very, very heavily. There's tons of research on each of these different waves, and there's tons of scholarship on what women were doing. We're just going to do a brief overview to make sure that you guys have some baseline knowledge. So first wave feminism was consciousness raising. How do we read the texts that men were schooled in so that women can then participate in public life? So women had been reading a lot of the ancient Greek texts because they were responsible in the home for ensuring that their sons were educated to the point that they could go to school at 12 or 13, depending on the wealth of the individual family. So the women had to account for a lot of that instruction until a tutor could be paid for, and then until their son went away to boarding school or went away to college. Okay, so with consciousness raising, women started looking at texts like Cicero. So instead of reading Cicero just to teach our sons how to be civic participants and what it means to be a civic participant in a democracy, especially an American democracy, women are now saying, how do we read this and understand it in a way so that we can participate? What is our place? How do we negotiate a new place for women within the world? This consciousness raising was very heavily tied to the abolitionist movement, and a lot of the early feminists were also educating abolitionists, free slaves, and saying, here are some of the texts you should read. Let's have discussions about this. The two movements ultimately broke off over the idea of prohibition, but there was a lot of consciousness raising between the two movements, and there was a lot of collaboration between the two movements so that everybody would get to the point where they could participate with what the white rich men who held all of the power and were the politicians already knew. So how do we get to that point so we can participate and to be taken seriously? Second wave feminism moves a little bit further and says, okay, so we've gotten to the point of consciousness raising, we're a little bit more aware, we need to start asking who's responsible for our current oppressive condition. Why are we still oppressed? Why are we still stuck in these roles? Third wave feminism looks to improve the lot of women. So their big mantra, equal pay for equal work. How do we value the work that is actually done at home? And these are still issues that are debated very heavily today. At this point, we're kind of to a post-feminist idea where we're struggling very heavily in real life today with what feminism means, who can participate, how do women who talk about feminism talk about it in an inclusive manner so that we're not leaving out other experiences. A lot of the way that women deal with feminism is through personal narrative. So if we're dealing with this through personal narrative, how do I account for my narrative? How do I create a paradigm surrounding my narrative that is inclusive at a city level, at a national level, at a global level? So we're talking race during Kirsch here, so that we can include as many women as possible, accounting for their different experiences and their different goals, but seeing all of it as this new idea of feminism. Post-feminism is a critique on feminism because post-feminism is the idea that feminism is won. Feminism has succeeded. Women have a place in society, so we don't need it anymore. And what it's relying very heavily on is the idea of capitalism. So capitalism provides us choice. Because we have choice, we have freedom. Because we have freedom to make choices, that means that we won. So if I go to the toothpaste aisle, I get a choice in which toothpaste to buy. I can buy Colgate, or I can buy Tom's, or I can buy Crest. Because I have a choice and I have power through my consumerism, feminism won. I don't need it anymore. And so there is a huge problem with how that capitalist version of post-feminism is influencing the idea that a lot of celebrities are dealing with feminism. So how do we try to meld all of these? That's pretty much where the debate right now about feminism is, and there's no clear-cut answer for any of this. And a lot of what they're dealing with and talking about is identification and redefinition. So if we go back to Burke's ideas of identification and redefinition, how do we butt up against this controversy and how do we redefine it? And if I redefine it and this other group over here redefines it, how do we come to some sort of a synthesis? So we've got thesis, antithesis. How do we come to a synthesis where we can all come to a common view that again is inclusive of more people, of more women? And then what does that mean? The big tie between all of these waves of feminism and most of the ideas that the feminists that Smith deals with are talking about is that gender is constructed through discourse. So yes, we may be born into bodies that show male or they show female, but the way that we act and the way that we construct that and what women are supposed to be and what men are supposed to be, and obviously depending on the theorists that you're talking about, it's what men are supposed to be and then everyone else. It's how we construct gender. So the clothing that we wear, the feminine, I'm wearing very girly necklaces today. So the fact that I called these girly and we're all okay with it, I'm constructing a gendered performance through language, through discourse practices that are understood. How does all of that meld with current conceptions of feminism? That's what we're dealing with today. Overall, the feminists are also dealing with the relationships between power, knowledge, and class, race, and gender. So while postmodernism is dealing with the relationship between power and knowledge, especially when it comes to history and how we write history and then individual places in current society, feminism is adding to that class, race, and gender. We need to account for the fact that different classes experience life differently, different races experience life differently, different genders experience life differently, and then once we start mixing all of the different combinations of those three together, we have a huge multiplicity of experiences that need to be discussed within theory instead of theorizing for one group and one class. Okay, so it's a lot of information. If you guys have any questions, you can send me an email. You can also tweet at me. That usually gets a much faster response. And if you have questions about your final project, make sure you email me because, again, your proposal is due in this module. I will see you guys in the discussion boards.